want to begin tonight by welcoming all of you. It's really just such a pleasure to see everyone here tonight, for all of us to be in this space, and I'm very excited about tonight's event. My name is Jennifer Durr. I am an associate professor of history at UC Santa Cruz and also the founding director of the Center for the Middle East and North Africa, and one of the principal investigators for the series that we will inaugurate this evening. Tonight's event is the first in a year-long Mellon Sawyer seminar on the theme of race, empire, and the environments of biomedicine. The individuals who will come to campus this year will share their expertise and their scholarship on a wide range of topics that are critically connected to questions of health and medicine and how they attach to structures of race and environmental transformation. I want to emphasize that the seminar is a tremendous opportunity for all of us at UC Santa Cruz to showcase and to learn from the work of practitioners and scholars who are at the forefront of these questions, and for us as a community to listen, to learn, to think, and also to reimagine. Among the subjects that our speakers will address this year are public health challenges within American Indian and Alaska Native Indigenous communities, the history of Black infant mortality in the US, and the tremendous power of American pharmaceutical companies to determine access to medicine across the globe. Jenny Reardon, who is a professor of sociology and director of the Science and Justice Research Cluster, is also one of the seminar's principal investigators. Anila Dowlatsai is our postdoctoral fellow, and Juliana Nzongo and Aaron Aruck are our graduate fellows, and I'm thrilled to say that everyone is here tonight. Maya Peterson, who was another one of the principal investigators for this project, died in childbirth in June of 2021. But in her thinking and her inspiration, she's here with us tonight, as she will be throughout this year. Before introducing our guest tonight, I would like to thank the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz, and especially Irena Polic and Jessica Guild, also Colleen Stone of the Science and Justice Research Cluster, and the very many individuals in Santa Cruz and beyond who worked with us to consider the conceptualization of this seminar and to help us invite guests into our community. Finally, I would like to thank the Mellon Foundation for their generous financial support. Now, with no further ado, I am thrilled to introduce tonight's speakers. Tahir Amin is founder and executive director of the Initiative for Medicines, Access, and Knowledge, a nonprofit organization that is working to address structural inequities in how medicines are developed and distributed. He has over 25 years of experience in intellectual property law, during which he practiced with two of the leading IP firms in the United Kingdom, and also served as IP counsel for multinational corporations. He has also served as a legal advisor and consultant to many international groups, including the European Patent Office and World Health Organization, and has testified before Congress on intellectual property and unsustainable drug prices. Amin and his organization have put out a 10-point plan for the Biden-Harris administration to bring equity into the patent system, and their work was recently highlighted in a New York Times editorial board's recent endorsement of patent reform. He is a former Harvard Medical School fellow in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine, and also a TED fellow. Finally, I would like to mention as a bit of good news that Amin's co-founder and director, Preeti Krishtel, was just awarded a MacArthur Genius Award, and we wish to congratulate her. Tahir will be in conversation tonight with Anna Barry Jester, who is a public health reporter with ProPublica. Previously, she was a senior correspondent covering public health at Kaiser Health News. Her series, Underfunded and Under Threat, with colleagues at KHN and the Associated Press, investigated how chronically underfunded public health departments buckled under the strain of the coronavirus pandemic. The project won awards from the Online News Association and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Her reporting on harassment and menacing threats endured by public health officials here in Santa Cruz County was the basis of an episode of This American Life, and PEN America later awarded its PEN Benison Courage Award to the officials that she profiled. Barry Jester has lived and worked in Latin America and Southeast Asia, where she has reported, photographed, and filmed stories in more than a dozen countries. She was also a writer at 538 and a producer at Univision and ABC News. So with that, I just want to say a few words about the structure of tonight's event. Tonight's event will consist of 3 different pieces. We'll first hear from Tahir. After that, Tahir and Anna will be in conversation, and then we will open the floor to questions and discussion. And with that, please join me in welcoming our guests to Santa Cruz and to the Kumba Jazz Center.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for inviting me to open this event, and I'm really honored. I'm going to try and compress 25 years of work into a matter of 25 minutes. And I want to tell a little story of my journey that brought me to this work, and hopefully give you an insight into the world that is out there that is trying to fight for access to medicines on behalf of almost 2 billion people that go without medicines. So it's 2005. I'm at a conference in Delhi. I just moved to India after leaving my job at a major law firm in London, where I advised multinational companies on how to protect their intellectual property. That's IP rights, that's what I'm going to refer to throughout the talk. Or, as many of you who are not familiar with this language, intangible property rights such as trademarks, patents, copyright. I'd been on the commercial side of IP law for a decade, since 1995, the same year the World Trade Organization and the multilateral agreement, the TRIPS agreement, which is the trade-related aspects of intellectual property, came about, it came to life. And as someone recently reminded me, just after Justin Bieber was born. Which shows how old I am. I'd left the commercial world having grave doubts about the laws I was implementing and enforcing, and I wanted to research from a public interest point of view the new knowledge economy built on a system of IP rules that was now impacting the majority world. And just for understanding, I'm going to switch between majority world and the global south. So this conference had gathered some of the leading academics and members of civil society from all disciplines to discuss the concern around the acceleration of property claims into all domains of knowledge and cultural practice. For someone fresh from the corporate world, the accounts I was hearing made me realize I had very little understanding of the impact of the IP system globally. From blocking access to medicines, to books, to how overzealous application of trademark and copyright laws were killing the creative community. But there was one comment from a talk at that conference that came to mind again recently as I watched the apartheid nature of the unequal distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and medical technologies, all while northern country governments, their companies, and a billionaire philanthropist that built his wealth through the TRIPS and IP laws refused to support removing IP protections and share the knowledge without restrictions so others could manufacture the vaccines and treatments to increase supplies themselves. So that comment was from an Indian academic and activist who said the global north was recolonizing the global south through the WTO and TRIPS agreement. Now, as a child of parents who suffered at the hands of colonialism during the Great Partition of India, the biggest mass migration of humans ever, I thought I knew something a little bit about colonialism. But until hearing that comment, I had never really thought about the political economy of IP and technology as being colonial in nature. I recall many in the audience that day felt it was a bit of a radical statement, and the language of colonialism was a thing of the past. We were now all living in a global village where the neoliberal policies of free trade and the flow of capital investment fostered by IP incentives would help everyone prosper, economically and technologically. So a few months after that conference, India passed a new patent law to become fully compliant with the requirements of the WTO and the TRIPS agreement. It meant India would now have to provide patent protection on pharmaceutical and food products, something that it had repealed in 1970 after it realized that it had some of the highest drug prices in the world under the old British colonial patent laws that had remained on the books until then. It was a decision that helped India actually develop its pharmaceutical industry, the powerhouse that it is today for generic products. It's what Doctors Without Borders has named the pharmacy of the poor. India was not the only country in the global south to have to introduce patents on pharmaceutical products, where there was previously no requirement. Some 50 countries that were now members of the WTO were required to or face trade penalties. So many of these countries, including India, were new nation states that had gained independence around the 1950s from disintegrating European empires. In their quest to close a technological gap, countries from the global south pushed the UN General Assembly in 1974 to resolve a declaration known as the New International Economic Order, in which wealthy countries would help formerly colonized ones become more self-reliant through the transfer of technology. It was imagined the UN resolution and the transfer of technology and scientific knowledge that would come with it would be the form of reparations for decades of imperial plunder. But the US rejected the idea and was unwilling to abandon enforcement of patent laws. Interestingly, around the same time, the then CEO of Pfizer, the big pharmaceutical company, Edmund Pratt, along with business leaders from the copyright industries, were fearing that manufacturers from the global south would become competitors for these new markets, and pushed US officials to integrate the defense of IP into US trade policy. This was the birth of the TRIPS agreement and the WTO, planting IP into the heart of trade for the first time, despite protests of the global south. And eventually, many of these global south countries were railroaded by the US and Europe into accepting IP as part of the global trade rules. The creation of the WTO and globalization of IP has coincided with some of the deadliest epidemics. When I arrived in India in 2004, the HIV/AIDS crisis was at its peak. Many in the global south had died because they had not been able to access new antiretroviral drugs. The pharmaceutical companies had set the prices at $15,000 for treatment, which many could not afford, including government budgets that would be stretched. There was also a racist element underlying all this, that brown and black lives were not of equal worth. The then director of USAID told the House of Representatives Committee on International Relations, rural Africans do not know what watches and clocks are. They use the sun. Since they won't be able to take medicines properly, it was pointless trying to provide treatment. Indian companies had by that time developed generic versions of these ARVs, these antiretrovirals, and had developed even the first AIDS drug cocktail, combining different drugs for easier adherence and affordability. In September 2000, the chairman of the Indian company Cipla, Yusuf Hamid, who I personally know very well, had told a meeting of European Union health ministers and CEOs of major pharmaceutical companies that he could offer antiretrovirals at $800 per person a year. That was at $1 a day. Having spoken with people who were there that day, they said Yusuf Hamid sucked the air out of the room. The CEOs of the major pharmaceutical companies, and some in the Western media, including the New York Times, called him a pirate for stealing IP in order to save lives. All of this was happening while South Africa was embroiled in a battle with 40 of the biggest pharmaceutical companies for changing its patent laws so it could import generic antibiotic drugs, with a view to also allowing to import generic HIV drugs. This was just 4 years after apartheid had ended in 1994. It also birthed what was known today in the public health circles, of which I am a part, as the Access to Medicines movement. Civil society was galvanized and backed Nelson Mandela's government. The pharmaceutical companies suffered a huge PR disaster and decided to withdraw their case. But it was only a momentary pause. Now that India, the pharmacy of the poor, had implemented its new patent law, the big pharmaceutical companies had their foot in the door, and sooner or later, the patents would start flowing. In the lead up to India passing its patent law, I worked with colleagues from all sectors of civil society, the government, and local industry to ensure there was some public health safeguards built into the patent law to ensure that the multinational pharmaceutical companies could not abuse the system for their interest. We did successfully get some provisions into the patent law that set more stringent standards in order to get a patent, and that anybody could oppose the granting of a patent by challenging a company's patent application at the patent office. Now, the challenging of patents of HIV drugs is the reason I co-founded IMAC. While it is one thing to get a law on the books, I knew from my corporate days of practicing law, it's another to implement and shape it. Between 2005 and 2011, a small group of us, civil society actors, sitting around a table with our laptops, were taking on these trillion-dollar industry. And we were able to challenge a number of the patents on first and second-line HIV drugs and a cancer drug that meant cheaper, affordable generic versions could reach more people in the global south. We scored notable victories in India, but also helped catalyze patent challenges across the world by civil society groups. For the first time, the patent offices around the world were not just the domain of private interests and clients. But the wheels of the pharmaceutical industry are always turning. Recognizing that they were not able to get their patent so easy, and that other country governments were now viewing India's patent law as a model, they became very concerned. And so over the next 5 years, they started setting up deals with key generic manufacturers, the manufacturers that were supplying these cheap, affordable drugs. Up to 80% of which were HIV drugs were coming from India to go to Africa. The deal being these manufacturers could sell to lower middle income markets, say some 100 countries, in exchange for not being sued. While on paper this seemed a noble gesture, it was a classic tactic of divide and rule. By separating the generic companies from the goals of civil society that until then had been in sync, they were able to start controlling the market again and supply. This strategy also divided civil society and does so still today. Many organizations in the global north, including the UN-housed agency UNITAID, supporting these market-based solutions as opposed to reversing the structural systems that keep power with a few. After a decade of pushing for global access to HIV drugs, another silent epidemic had emerged, hepatitis C. Treatments for hepatitis C until 2010 were in injectable form, and by all means, pretty toxic for anybody who was taking them. Around 2010, 2011, trials were showing that new antiviral pills that could be taken orally, which could cure HCV, were now a possibility. So in terms of science, it was a remarkable thing. The science, though, around these drugs were very much modeled on the HIV antiviral drugs. So, again, civil society learning the lessons from the HIV issues, which was more of a reactive response to events, actually started to plan much earlier. I remember presenting to colleagues in Paris the looming patent situation that we could be facing in order to get global access to these new hepatitis C drugs. Working with Doctors Without Borders and the Open Society Foundation, we embarked on the first coordinated multi-country patent challenge for the drug that would be known as Sovaldi and priced at $84,000 in the US. We filed the first challenge in India even before the drug was approved, followed by challenges in Argentina, Brazil, China, Egypt, Europe, Thailand, Ukraine, Morocco. It caught Gilead, which is actually a Californian company, the company that had the patents, and by surprise. It also caught the whole industry by surprise. We scored an initial victory, but Gilead naturally appealed the decision. Now, when we think about the political economy of IP, this particular story sits with me in terms of the power of the system. A few months after the decision to reject Gilead's patent, President Obama had made a visit to India, and on the table for discussion was trade and IP issues. By coincidence, within months of his visit, the decision to reject the patent had been reversed, and the Patent Office ended up granting the patent. According to the Indian magazine Caravan, the examiner who had rejected the patent had been removed from his position, and Gilead had also visited the patent offices during that time. 7 years on, we are still in court in India appealing this decision. Despite this setback, we won cases in China and in other countries supporting our colleagues' work. But by then, as with HIV drugs, the companies had started making deals with generic companies, and that could potentially compete and eventually regain control of the market and the IP issue. Even though we may not have been able to open the market the way we wanted, our coordinated patent challenges had shown the power of civil society and the ability to extract some gains. Now, the problem of affordable medicines and IP monopolies is not just one about the Global South. This is the story that many have actually have told people, oh, this is a Global South problem, this is an African problem. The US is facing a drug pricing crisis like it has never seen before. Roughly 34 million Americans know at least one friend or family member who died in the past 5 years because they could not afford treatment. To the present, and the biggest public health crisis in over 100 years. COVID-19, over the past 2 years, countries and public health advocates in the Global South have tried to lift restrictions of IP in order to increase supply of vaccines and other treatments. Today, some 2.5 billion in the Global South are unvaccinated. After 18 months of delay and resistance from the US, EU, and pressure from the pharmaceutical lobby, the WTO did eventually agree to allow countries to bypass patents on just vaccines but not treatments. Something the TRIPS agreement actually already allows, but historically, whenever countries have used it, the US and EU always assert pressure and trade sanctions. One of the reasons why there was resistance to allowing countries in the Global South to produce their vaccines was what I have termed scientific racism. There was this idea that, oh, well, these companies can't make these drugs, they can't make these vaccines, they're too complex. And as a result, it delayed, and throughout the debate, the goalposts kept shifting, and these companies kept moving the arguments around. The COVID pandemic has shown that despite the important battles that have been won along the way in terms of making medicines more accessible, they have ultimately failed in changing the deeper structural flaws of the IP system that many in the public health world are now recognizing and are openly saying needs to be decolonized. A significant part of the reason, in my opinion, is the global health system's philanthropy and even civil society has been captured by neoliberal market solutions rather than human rights. Which takes me back to that conference in 2005, which is where it all started for me, and the comment that was made about the WTO and the globalized IP system being the recolonization of the Global South. It has taken 17 years and a global pandemic for many of us to realize or accept the colonial nature of the IP system and the institutions like the WTO. That academic and activist was right all along. We were just catching up now. Or, with the social justice movements like Black Lives Matter and issues that have emerged in the last decade, the time is now right to change the language and narrative. The big question is, what are we going to do for the next 17 years for future pandemics and addressing climate change? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for that. That was fascinating and also really wonderful because it can be so easy to get lost in the weeds of IP. It gets, you lose yourself in technical speak and in legislation and language like that. But really, the whole point here is that humans are at the center of it. And so it's nice to hear your very human story about how you've come through this journey. I thought we'd maybe start a little bit by talking about the COVID vaccine. It is the most recent, but also in some ways one of the largest efforts to change the global intellectual property regime that we live under. So, we had this pandemic, obviously in global in nature, a great understanding that everyone would need some kind of access to prevention if we were going to do something about it, because that's how infectious diseases work, right? And originally there was these efforts, as you said, to ask for exceptions to the patents on the vaccines. The US ultimately went out in favor of that. The EU was very much against that effort. But there were some exceptions made. It came quite late in the process. In its place, what we got was a sort of donation and philanthropy model. There was this idea that we're going to create an organization who would get wealthy countries to donate vaccines, and that those would then go to countries who couldn't afford to buy at the market prices that we pay in the United States. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about why you think that doesn't work, why that donation model has not been successful.
Well, for me, I think the problem is when the US, for example, says we're going to donate X amount of vaccines, it means it's still in the control of those who have the power. And when we have systems like COVAX, which was supposed to be this buying sort of body that was going to buy vaccines for the global south, what happened was many of the wealthy countries double dipped. Not only were they making contracts with the manufacturers directly, they were also putting in their contracts with COVAX, which was this body run by Gavi. And the biggest problem was there wasn't enough supply. We weren't actually trying to increase supply. Now, you may have read, if you followed all this, that, there are only so many manufacturers that can make these vaccines. And that's why I referred to the idea of scientific racism, because it's been proven, and evidence has appeared like a year on. We had to go out there and prove there were numbers of other manufacturers that could even make these new mRNA vaccines. And so really what I think Gavi's big mistake is, and Gavi, and I'm going to say this very bluntly.
Can you explain Gavi a little bit?
So Gavi is the International Vaccine Alliance, which is basically was set up to kind of improve access to vaccines. I actually consulted for them back in 2012 and wrote a paper about this very issue, but for pneumococcal vaccines, rotavirus, and HPV, human papillomavirus. And that whole paper was actually about how we could improve the IP situation, so developing country vaccine manufacturers could actually avoid IP barriers. They never published that report because Seth Berkley, who's the now leaving CEO, he didn't believe that IP was the issue. So basically, COVAX, rather than being a public health body that was actually saying we need to pull all levers to try and increase supply, because, and I'm going to say this very bluntly, the paymasters are people like Bill Gates. They don't believe in rupturing the IP system. And so basically, COVAX was this body that was just sitting there trying to actually ask for donations, ask for supplies, but wasn't getting enough. And so meanwhile, the countries that were reliant on COVAX couldn't get it because there was no supplies coming in. So in a way, this whole charitable model of like, we'll either donate because I'm a rich country. The Europeans like to go around saying, we donated the most. Doesn't matter. Countries should be able to make their own products whenever they need it in a pandemic. And that wasn't happening. And for me, that's why this has been the continuous problem in all the crises that we've had over the last 20 years. It's always been a case of, we want to stay in control, we being the North, and we will determine when you get your drugs or when you get your vaccines or what have you. It's never been a case of, you know what, we're going to help you and we're going to make sure that you can do whatever you need. And that's what this whole battle was about. They set up these artificial bodies like COVAX to create this impression that it's going to be a success and that they can purchase all these vaccines. But what can you purchase if there are not enough out there? And all the other countries have actually gobbled them all up. I mean, Canada had 6 times, they could actually vaccinate their people 6 times over compared to people in Africa. I mean, it's ridiculous. But this is a story that doesn't get told in the media. And they say, but we've got these great mechanisms like COVAX. They don't work. You've got to make people self-sufficient. What's that thing? Teach a man to fish and all that?
And so, if I understand correctly, your argument is that you'd like to see that the patent are restricting essentially the quantity in this case, right, of vaccines available, and what we needed was to grow the supply and not operate from a scarcity model.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, but the thing is, the scarcity model was like we don't want to disturb the IP system. The Pfizers and the Modernas I mean, even just a couple of weeks ago, Stefan Bancel, the Moderna CEO, who's now a multi-billionaire, is basically saying, like, you know, trying to copy their vaccine is like ripping off a Louis Vuitton bag. I mean, I don't know who his PR department is, but you know, it's all about the IP. It's like we cannot mess with the IP system, and there's a deeper aspect to that. And this is when I get to the colonial aspect, or it's a power thing, because they don't want other countries catching up technologically. There's this big fear here in the United States. You know, I spent a lot of time on the Hill, and the pro-IP crowd was saying, oh, well, you know, if we remove the IP barriers, China's going to come in and win. It's just scaremongering. The US has enough capability to always stay in front, but the thing is, though, it doesn't need to actually block others from doing so.
Let's dig into that. Let's go there for a second. So obviously, as you know very well, the argument in favor of the patent regime that we have is that it sparks innovation, right? So you are a company, and you know that if you come up with a drug that people want to buy, governments want to buy, that you are guaranteed to have a financial windfall. I wonder, if, first of all, I'm curious if you believe that.
Well, I know Jonas Salk did believe that when he said, "Can you patent the sun?" But anyway, I mean, there's been other examples. Penicillin wasn't patented.
Is everyone familiar with Jonas Salk and the example there? Okay,
yeah, it was
just to make sure.
yeah.
Good.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. But the other thing is when we talk about, it's going to disturb innovation, it's going to disturb inventiveness and what have you, if you look at the mRNA vaccines, a lot of the original research happened at Pennsylvania University. Public funding went into it. I mean, Moderna exists because of yours and mine taxpayers' dollars. And yet the rewards go to, you know, Mr. Louis Vuitton. And so this is the problem with the system, the idea that it's only the private actor that can actually create these products. That's not the case. It's not true. Many drugs that come to market start their life in university labs. Now, I'm not saying that you don't need the private enterprise to kind of come in and scale it up, but there's a big difference between inventing something and then innovating it to bring it to market. Those are two different concepts. What's happened is we've muddied it all up, and we've kind of like said, oh, commercializing something to market is inventive. That's the kind of system we live in now. So you're not really inventing, you're kind of commercializing to bring it to market. It's important, but it's not like that's the last mile. It's not the big Herculean sort of discovery process that is, you know, laid out that we're all led to believe happens by these private actors. In fact, pharmaceutical companies today act more like venture capitalists buying things up than actually inventing anything. It's the financialization of the system where basically they act like Wall Street brokers.
Maybe you can elaborate a little bit. You mentioned hepatitis C and this work that you've done trying to challenge the patent. And it's a really interesting example of the US patent system versus other countries. It is not the only example, but there have been cases of drugs that are patented in the United States that are not able to receive a patent in other countries because at this point in time, we have a fairly liberal interpretation of what can be granted a patent in the United States. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about what your argument was for not granting a patent for the hepatitis C drugs in other countries.
So that particular drug, which we worked on for challenging it, it was actually... So the way it works in the patent system is you have to show that it's something that's new, i.e. novel, and it's not obvious to somebody in that field based on what already exists in the art, as we say, in the field. Now, there was earlier patents that literally, bar one slight substitution in the chemical molecule that already existed and showed, and it would have been obvious for somebody to do that change. But the way the patent system works is basically, unless it's specifically written, it's actually considered inventive and it's non-obvious. That was our argument for that, Sovaldi. Now, Sovaldi is a great drug. It cured people, 95% cure rate. Sure, it's important. Somebody should be rewarded for that. But actually, when you look at the backstory of that, the person who invented that was working at Pharmaset. He was actually a PhD graduate who is now working in a pharmacy somewhere in Georgia. The owner of Pharmaset went on to become a multimillionaire. and totally shafted him. That story never gets told. And the drug itself, actually, as useful as it is actually on a science basis not that inventive. But the thing is, though, we have to reward someone. That's the patent system. It's kind of like we have to be seen to, if it's got use, then it doesn't matter what the inventive aspect is. And so I always say, you know, if it's about investment, if it's about something that's useful, then let's stop talking about innovation and invention. Let's just say, yeah, you invested, it's something useful, it really helps people's lives. Great, you get some kind of reward. But what we've done is we've created this kind of mythical, like, you know, everything's so inventive, everything's so innovative, and it's actually repeat science. You know, it reminds me of a judge in England who's passed away. He was the best IP judge I've ever known, and I don't often speak highly of judges. He actually said, he did this seminal speech after he'd retired. He actually left the High Court bench because he said he was bored. He said, what's invention got to do with it? Everything in science is obvious. He says the only reason we have the patent system is to drive investment. And so my argument is all this talk of innovation, which the industry always likes to kind of roll out and say, if we don't give, we can't charge these prices or what have you, we're going to kill innovation. Most science is obvious. The question is, how do we incentivize? So I think that's an important thing to unpack in, you know, in these debates like the Savaldis. Sure, we want the newer drugs, we want them to be useful, but the reward system is over incentivizing these kinds of behaviors. Companies will tweak, they'll extend patents. We just come out with a report that shows on the top-selling drug Humira, which is, you know, it's for rheumatoid arthritis, which many seniors take. AbbVie has filed over 300 patents on this drug. And they were able to prevent competition from coming in by 7 years. So Europeans were getting this drug in 2018. Prices dropped 80%. We're still waiting here in the US, and we're paying top dollar. They play these games with the patent system, and they use the innovation word all the time. It's just like this. It's almost like, as I was saying to Anna when we were, it's like, you know, the Men in Black thing. The moment you say innovation, psh, everyone just stops thinking. And we have to break that cultural construct, because that is the number one PR tool of the industry. That's how they capture everyone.
So I want to get to, of course, what you think we should be doing differently. But I want to go back a little bit to, because one thing I really appreciate is you talking about the international dynamics here. And as you referenced, you know, many countries built their pharmaceutical, you know, industries without having a strict patent regime in place, because, you know, you do sort of basic research, you do basic development, you do basic manufacturing, and that allows you to do more complicated or newer things as things goes on. It tends to be how these systems get built. And you mentioned that sort of with the COVID vaccine, for example, that if more countries, more places had manufacturing ability, whether it was because they were able to you know, develop things because of the patents or because they'd already had manufacturing capacity in place, we would have had more vaccine, and that would be a good thing. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about why else it would be good to have more nations, I mean, maybe it's a little obvious, but like, why should we have more manufacturing capacity than we currently have? Why not just have it, you know, centered in a few places?
Well, I think we've seen what happens when we have a few manufacturers. We see that many people go without. The projections when COVID started, or when we started rolling out vaccines, was that many in Africa wouldn't see the vaccine until 2023-24, and that's proven true. So back in 2020, that was the projection, and it's proven true. Concentrated production has never solved the problem, and this is why there's been a big battle in public health space to kind of localize production. Now, there are problems with that too, because initially when you localize production, the costs are going to be higher because you have to build up the capacity. This is one of the arguments of why the Brazilian ARV manufacture generics was always a problem, because like you know, one of the ARV drugs, antiretroviral drugs, was costing way more in Brazil when they started to produce it themselves. But the thing is, you have to build that capacity. And when it comes to future pandemic preparedness, and I think even with things such as with climate change, unless we decentralize, we are going to have some severe problems in terms of addressing these problems. And these are going to be problems that are not just going to be like, oh, in some far-off country that's not going to cause us problems. These are going to be global. And I think there is a push now to kind of decentralize production.
Right, we saw that with the COVID vaccine, in that India had manufactured a certain amount of vaccine and then got hit with a wave of COVID,
Exactly.
and understandably decided that they would not
Absolutely.
export that vaccine at that time. So you have those sort of nationalistic tendencies that can be an issue, but I hear you also saying, like, with climate change, we can't be shipping things all around the world. We need to have some sort of domestic production as well.
And I think that's the thing. It's like, when you think about it, back to the COVAX thing. The COVAX thing was like, they came up with this wonderful idea, this utopian idea that everyone was going to behave normally. No. I mean, Bill Gates is so smart that he basically only went with Serum Institute, the Indian manufacturer, for the AstraZeneca vaccine. I mean, there are stories out there that actually the Oxford Jenner Institute was trying to do this open source. And then eventually he intervened, said, no, you need to pair it with a commercial entity because you won't be able to do this yourselves and what have you, which I can see some argument there. But, for all his intelligence, he decided to just go with one manufacturer, which was Serum, which is the biggest manufacturer of vaccines globally. But the thing is, though, there were so many others that they could have done that with. And eventually, 6 months after, they started trying to transfer the ability to make the AstraZeneca vaccine elsewhere. Now, of course, the mRNA vaccine proved to be much more effective, even though the AstraZeneca vaccine was still useful. But that delay, that ability not to transfer the technology sooner, and there were companies, people I spoke to in India were saying, why didn't they give it to us? So only by diversifying production can we really solve these big global crises. Otherwise, we're going to be faced with these kind of bottlenecks all the time, and that's why I really do believe it has to be the next agenda for anybody who's trying to, in the public health space, to try and sort of think about what pandemic preparedness looks like.
Well, and the World Health Organization has been quite vocal on this issue in a way that I've not heard them in the past. The U.S. is quite powerful in all of these international bodies, and we have a very clear line on the way that patents should work. That very clear orientation. We're also one of the very few countries in the world where people don't have a right to health care. That also plays quite considerably into some of these international frameworks and how we think about our obligations to one another as nations. But I wondered, one of the things that the WHO has been doing is trying to set up essentially a network, a hub of countries and pharmaceutical companies that could develop vaccines generally, not just the COVID vaccine. And I wonder if you think it's possible to do that within the framework we have right now, within the TRIPS agreement, within the World Trade Organization, within the the patent regime that the United States and Europe are promoting.
First of all, I'm really sort of impressed by Dr. Tedros, who's the current Director General at WHO. He's from Ethiopia. He's really actually led by example for the Global South and has put issues on the table that previously I've never seen any director at the WHO do. So, like as Anna's saying, the WHO has really tried to push the agenda here, or the boundaries. Now, with the hub thing, Afrigen is trying to actually reverse engineer the Moderna vaccine. And I think they've got so far, but they are going to run up against IP issues. Now, unfortunately, as I alluded to in my talk, where I say civil society has been captured by market forces, one of the organizations that is actually advising them is the Medicines Patent Pool, which was what caused the initial fissures in the civil society movement about actually making deals with generic companies. And they are saying that we will not infringe any IP. So that means then we're going to be stuck, because there's either they push them away from infringing anything, in which case they're going to have to. It's going to take longer to develop the alternative version of the mRNA, the Moderna vaccine, or if they infringe, they're going to get sued by Moderna. Now, from lessons of South Africa, where the 40 pharmaceutical companies came in and tried to sue Mandela's government, I say bring it on. Call their bluff, see what they do, see how the world reacts. But that's not happening. And I think actually partially, I sit here as a person of the global north, but I've worked in the global south enough, and I speak with people from the global south every day. I know it doesn't give me the right to say it, but they are saying their country governments need to do more. They need to stand up to this. What happened at the WTO, the way they all backed down and made this kind of half-baked deal, where no deal would have been better than the deal that they got, they also need to actually stand up. They also need to challenge the existing structural systems.
Yeah, so within TRIPS, there are exceptions, right? There's a way that you're supposed to be able to say, like, look, this drug is of public health importance. It's really important. We have to navigate around this patent system. In theory, that's how it's supposed to be. Why doesn't that happen more often?
Because of trade sanctions. Now, every time during the HIV/AIDS crisis, during the hepatitis C, I already told you, President Obama visited India. Next day, the patent's already granted. I'm not saying that these things happen sort of deliberately, but there is definitely a lot of trade pressure. The US Patent Office is always making visits to the patent offices around the world. So a lot of this is actually, we have harmonization at the international level, we have invisible harmonization at institutional levels.
Can you say what you mean by harmonization?
Harmonization is where the US and Europe are trying to get every country to have their kind of law. And that's the whole goal of the World Trade Organization, is to kind of like sort of live in our mirror image. And the irony is, as I said about this whole colonial aspect of it, is many of the countries in the global north that have reached technological ascendancy never had patent laws for a while when it suited them. Switzerland only introduced patent laws. Switzerland's a home to some of the major pharmaceutical companies in the world. They only introduced patent laws in the sort of mid-70s, which is pretty recent when you think about it. Germany in the late 60s. They had the space and policy space, which goes back to your local production point. They had the space to create their industry, to grow it. They denied the Global South that by creating TRIPS and the World Trade Organization. Now imagine if the shoe was on the other foot, and in the United States or in the UK where I'm from, we needed that technology. And someone said, nope, we're going to bring this law, give you the illusion that it's going to be economic development, and then totally just put a chokehold on you. We wouldn't like it. That's the reality of the situation. But they sold it in a way, they said, oh, well, you get better deals on your textiles and your agriculture. But they weren't, many of these countries weren't net technology exporters, they were importers. So they got a bad deal.
So, let's see here. You clearly have this very global focus and have been working often on behalf of countries or with people in countries where they're not manufacturers of pharmaceuticals and vaccines. Why switch your focus to the United States and putting even more attention and effort into this country?
So we were actually invited to sort of take on the issue here in the US after we did that multi-coordinated work around the hepatitis C drug. That particular drug was the beginnings of the drug pricing conversation here in the United States. It was priced at $84,000. Many people living with hepatitis C today still don't get that drug, particularly people in prisons and what have you. It's still too costly. And there was a foundation that actually said, well, we've read about your work. We're curious to see whether you could replicate it here in the United States. And I immediately said, no chance. Because I know what the system's like. It's impossible to penetrate because the patents are sacrosanct in the United States. I mean, some people argue that it's part of the Constitution, I mean, there is a clause in there, it's written, but it doesn't say anything about patents. It's just been made into patents. But the reason why we took on the challenge was because we felt, one, it was the right time, because there was an investigation by the Wyden and Grassley Commission that over 2,000 pages of subpoenaed documents and what have you that showed the practice of pharmaceutical companies. Gilead wantingly priced it whatever price they wanted because they said, we want to make a quick return. And this kind of helps the public understand how the industries work. And so we felt like it was a good time. The challenges weren't successful ultimately, but what we did was we said we need to educate people about the patent system. We need to educate why drugs are costing so much more for so much longer. And I think we've had a breakthrough. I think for once, for now, I mean, in the last 3 years, you've got senators and Congress people actually having investigations about drug pricing in the United States. They're talking about patents, which they never would have. And the reason why we do that here is because the US is the driver of the global agenda when it comes to IP and patents. And if we can actually change some things here, it gives hope to our colleagues in the global south, because then they can point and say, look, you're doing it. Why can't we? Unfortunately, we still live in that kind of paradigm. But at least it's a way of changing some of the dynamics. So for example, if we were able to change some aspect of the way patent system works here, the Indias and whatever could say, well, we don't have to do that then. But that's how it works. And so it's changing the dynamics and the power dynamics.
So what are some of the things that you think should be done?
So I think there are incremental approaches, which are things like fixing aspects of the patent system. So for example, making it harder to get a patent in the first place. I mean, some of the games that get played now, it's amazing what companies can get away with. I mean, we just created this database of all the patents on the top 10 selling drugs. And as I was sifting through them, it's a boring life. As I was sifting through them, I saw one for this product, which is I think it's for macular degeneration, Eylea. And they filed a patent, basically how to keep a needle sterile as you take it out of the packaging. And that's just one example. But that's the kind of, part of my language, crap that gets patented and actually extends the monopoly power. So I think, first of all, let's just really change how we grant the patents in the patent system. But ultimately, when we're talking, I think what we also need is we need to have actually greater public participation in these institutions. These are literally the clients of these, the patent offices are all private actors. They're all the companies. They go in there, make all the deals and make all the arrangements, and the public is not part of these conversations. And that goes to that point about invisible harmonization. We need better actors in there. I think that was one of the successes of the work we did in India. We took people living with HIV to the patent offices, sat them in front of the examiners, even in Argentina, and it kind of humanized the situation, because otherwise patents are just documents that corporations talk about. We have to humanize the patent offices. The impact of intellectual property on human lives, that never gets spoken about. People just don't make that connection. I think ultimately when we talk about knowledge systems, which is the bigger shift, all knowledge, in my mind, is built off other knowledge. So the idea that we can actually proprietize anything is kind of almost like a myth to me. I think if we look at just for thousands of years, knowledge has been built on other things. We wouldn't have half the things we have today if it wasn't built on other things. I mean, we wouldn't have artificial intelligence if the Arabs hadn't actually kept all the theory of algebra from the Greeks. We forget about all this. And I actually think the ultimate place we need to get to, the destination, is open science, where we have a more collaborative system. Now, governments can fund it, governments can actually reward actors, but we can't have one person, a few companies proprietizing the entire body of knowledge. Because when you think about it from that buzzword innovation point of view, pharmaceutical companies, when they patent stuff, they literally fence off huge areas of research so that nobody can actually go in there and do anything. So you might not be getting the drug that you really need because a company might be sitting on it saying, well, this is not profitable for me. I'm not going to actually pursue it. But you're preventing somebody else from coming in and doing it. And that's, for me, is why I think something open is that all people can come in and work on it. And then you come to some arrangement where it be, there's shared royalties, there's shared sort of whatever your investment cost is. But I think a lot of the drugs are actually, the government funds, they need to get better provisions in there for access. So when the US government, the NIH, which is actually the biggest funder, so to the tune of $40 billion the last I counted, of public health research in the drug space, they need to get more back. They need to, when they write these contracts with the private actors, they say, you know what, you have to sell this drug at X price in the global south. You cannot overcharge. You have to make it available, or you have to make deals with other companies so that they can make it. There's simple things that we can do, but they won't do because they won't dare touch the industry. And I think these are some of the solutions. But ultimately, I think open science is the way.
I want to ask you one follow-up question on that, and then I'd love to take questions from the audience, so if you want to start thinking about your questions. You spoke about how, in some ways, the efforts to get around the current intellectual property regime have just reinforced it. Do you have any concerns that the work that you're doing now, trying to sort of incrementally fix some of the patent system in the United States, might undermine your ultimate goal of open science?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to first shrink the system a little bit. It's kind of just growing and it's out of control. So I think at least trying to contain the monster a little bit is so that it can be a bit more manageable. So I'm hoping that, compared to some of the efforts in terms of like where some of our colleagues have said, well, as long as companies are making these licensing deals, it's okay, as long as we get the access to the drugs. I think that actually is making the roots deeper of the existing system. What we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of lift some of those roots out a little bit and sort of make the next battle a little bit more manageable. But it is an important question because I think a lot of the problems is when you're dealing with power structures the way they are, it's very hard, and when you don't see any shifts, and funders and philanthropy is also a problem because they want quick wins. They're not in it for the long game. We're all, the whole field is afflicted by short-termism. It's really hard to get, you've got to win legislation. And so you have to work within the system a little bit, but you have to kind of create opportunities outside it as well. And so I think that's the fine balance that we try to play with.
Okay, great. I think we're going to take questions. Jennifer has a microphone here.
I do. The microphone is magically on. Great. Okay, so if you raise your hand, Juan, I saw your hand go up first, so I will travel.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I want to ask you a question to clarify your own position. In order to do that, I need to take a minute. If we think of the relationship between capitalism and knowledge, a whole lot of the patent system and IP regime regulates who has access to more or less modern technologies. That is to say, it determines lifestyles. But life there is anyway, traditional or otherwise, there is life. The difference in the biomedicine realm is that it regulates who lives and who dies. So it turns into a necropolitics. Not a biopolitics simply, but a necropolitics. So my question, to clarify your own position, is, are you making a case for the collectivization or disappearance of the IPR, the intellectual property regime in general, or are you trying to carve out a space, the biomedical one, in which knowledge is regulating life and death?
Oh, you put me on the spot. I think ultimately, given, and I don't have a crystal ball, but given the crisis, I've worked on climate change, IP technologies too. I think we're going to face this there too. Already we have that issue where country governments in the global south have been saying, well, give us some more of these green mitigation technologies. So I don't think it's per se of the biomedicine issue. I do believe if we want to actually collectively resolve some of the bigger crises that we are likely going to face, I don't want to be doomsday, but I think we've already seen some of these things happening. I think we're going to have a better collective system. And I don't think the IP is that. I think it's an old way of thinking. I was reading an article somewhere the other day saying sort of like, old thinking will break your brain. And I think we're literally walking around with broken brains because we're just literally repeating the same things, doing the same systems. It's like a 200-300-year-old system and it hasn't evolved. It's actually got worse. And so I do think we need to get out of it. I do think we need to think of a better way. That's not to say that people can't be incentivized, they don't get some rewards. But I think this kind of, the sort of end-stage capitalism we've reached with the IPR system is killing us.
Yeah, this is just a quick statement more than a question supporting some of what you're saying. As I started my career as a research chemist at a pharmaceutical company, and we were doing new drug applications. And as soon as anything looked like it was going to work, we would make every possible variant and patent them all. We'd just wall off everything in that area. So
No, I really appreciate that, because many people, when you have somebody who's in civil society say that thing, I mean, I practice as an attorney in this space, and so I have a modicum of credibility. But somebody from the industry, and I've always said the more scientists can speak up, the more people who've been in industry and speak to these issues, because ultimately you guys really have the know-how and the knowledge of how science works, because science is very complex to the layperson. And when I hear that, I kind of, my heart fills, because I think, we're not out here just totally shouting at the wall.
Can I see hands? Okay, geography is determining this, but I'm arriving on the other side of the room.
So I just wondered if you could explain insulin a little bit. We're talking about $35 insulin, and it's not even really a drug. From my perspective, it's naturally occurring substance. Why is insulin such? I mean, it's a huge market, but why is it expensive? Is it really expensive to make it, or is it just complete profit grab?
Yeah, I'm really glad you just brought that up. Actually, I don't have the name of a paper has just come out actually on insulin that really tackles some of these issues. I think it's well worth a read. I can share it with whoever, who could dispense the information. So yes, naturally occurring insulin, whether it be from animals, existed in the early 1900s and what have you. But what we have now is synthetic insulin, like for example, the products that we pay high prices for now. What we have is an oligopoly. We have 3 companies that basically control the insulin market. And for anybody to try and break that, it's kind of proven really impossible. And I think that is, so it's a structure of the market, the way you've got 3 actors who are just holding everything together. And then you've also got some IP issue in there. Some of those issues have gone away. But what's happened is, like, for example, with Sanofi's product Lantus, I don't know if anybody takes Lantus.
Unfortunately.
Yeah. So, we did a study on Lantus, this is the French company, Sanofi, and, they were able to prevent competition from coming in because of these kind of really ridiculous patents that they'd filed, which the system had granted, but then they had to be challenged. So you waste 4 or 5 years of meddling around in the courts. I mean, when we think about the patent system and the patent office, you're supposed to think that the patent system is controlling how long a term is for a patent. It's not the case. All this is decided in court. It's like in the billionaire's playground of the court system. They decide how long a patent lasts for. And so basically what after the 10, 12 years of exclusivity that they should have, they're still holding the power. And I think that's the problem with the insulin market, is we need to break the power of those 3 companies, the Eli Lillys, the Sanofis, and I forget the third one. But they're the ones who are holding. And if you look at it, they literally shadow price everything. So everything goes up together.
So I wanted to find out if you know what the winning argument was for not for challenging the human genome. That wasn't patented.
Yeah.
What was the winning argument for that?
I believe because it was going to benefit science.
Oh.
Jenny, did you want to follow up?
It was going to benefit science, but it was going to allow all these other companies to mine and become rich off it.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question, particularly going to your point about open science, actually. It was the pharmaceutical companies who wanted the patents to go away for DNA, for patenting DNA, because it's the variation, the genetic variation, that they wanted to be able to get access to in order to have, ideas about targets, new targets. And so I actually was going to ask you about your idea about open science, because I think we need more information beyond open. I think I'd love to hear ideas about structurally, how to create an open system. If you had to name 3 top things you would put in your open system, what would it be? Because any open system is going to have to be governed.
Yeah.
It isn't just a free-for-all. So what are your 3 top things you're going to put in your open system as governance mechanisms?
Wow. I'm thinking on the fly now. Good question. I think first of all, if we think about what happened in the Creative Commons space, the copyright space, there was a kind of an open source system where basically if you borrowed something, you would attribute. Now, in the pharmaceutical space, you might not be able to do that because obviously there's a lot more money involved and it's not just some content. But I think actually there should be either some either you collaborate with the original producer of that particular science, and then whatever comes out of that, you both get the gains of it. I think governments actually should encourage open science by creating ways that they will invest in the open science, and then they will determine, like as I was saying, they will determine basically how then that gets distributed. A third point I would say is that if we have a monopoly situation, that we have an automatic open science system that comes in. Now we have a system whereby you have this compulsory licensing. If basically somebody's not relinquishing their patent, a government can override it and allow somebody to make it. I think we should do that for research, even things that aren't actually on the market for product. I think we should actually make, unless there's a product on the market, it should be available open science for research. Now, there are provisions for that, but there are always battles that are going on behind the scenes about who's got the right to research, who hasn't. And I think we need to kind of clear all that out of the way to kind of at least really make some progress in terms of showing what open science can achieve without all these other legal bottlenecks. And those are very on the fly, but I've got more learnings to do on the open science model. It's part of the research that I'm working with in terms of how do we actually craft a different environment for the biomedical research.
All right, thank you so much for that answer, and thanks for a terrific talk and this extraordinarily animated Q&A. It was really, really helpful and compelling. My question follows on Jenny's a little bit about open science, but relates back to the COVAX issue and this charitable philanthro-capitalist model that Gavi has been orchestrating in Geneva for providing a sort of a charitable supply late in the day of vaccines to under-resourced places that seek to save lives while saving IP at the same time. So that's sort of been the outcome, and you described the problems of it really well. But I'm wondering if, and this goes back to open science, whether you could also kind of sketch for us one of the other kind of contexts in which Gavi's and COVAX's development happened, which seems to me to have been vaccine nationalism and the rise of a more reactionary, nationalistic approach by governments like our own here in the United States, but others too, like to some extent Russia and China with their vaccines, and the ways in which that kind of created a context of like vaccine hoarding, against which the charitable approach could be made to seem like, oh, this is the liberal alternative. We are the only alternative that's going to get vaccines to the rest of the world, and yet it did so in a way that completely preserved the hegemony of this IP system that you've described so well for us tonight.
Yeah, no, I think the vaccine nationalism even played into COVAX as well. It's if I'm understanding you correctly, I just felt that because governments were, this was supposed to be, my understanding of COVAX was this is supposed to be for those countries who are going to have it hard to kind of get their vaccines. But you had, as I understand it, the richer countries also buying into the COVAX initially. And I think that just basically sort of polluted the whole thing immediately. And so what was available wasn't really available for those countries. And so nationalism kind of seeped into the COVAX model, which ideologically, or from a utopian point of view, sounded good. But the powerful countries just raided the shop, so to speak, and took whatever they could get from directly with manufacturers. And then at the same time, COVAX never had any power to kind of get pharmaceutical companies to say, well, when the next doses were coming. I remember being on a call with the WHO director, and one of the speakers there was saying, we would ask them, where are the vaccines? Are they just hidden? They just, they weren't providing them. They weren't providing them any information. Most of the contracts that were made by pharmaceutical companies were all secret. And there's a battle going on now. I think there was just a hearing in the European Parliament about Ursula von Leyen is actually in trouble for her negotiations with Pfizer by text, when it should have, it broke protocols. So there's a lot of this secret stuff that was going on, and I think a body like COVAX needs to actually have some power. And it didn't. It didn't have any power. It was actually still acting on behalf of the philanthrocapitalists, ultimately. And so, I think it ended up being a part of the whole vaccine nationalist sort of episode. It didn't really break from that, ultimately.
Hi. Hello. So I actually have so many questions. I'm only going to ask 2 of them. But I also have a statement that I wanted to make, which is kind of a question, but not quite. So like in regards to open source, like what role do you feel like negative data plays in that? Because something that we often hide in research is data that doesn't support our hypothesis or doesn't support our desired observations. And I feel like a lot of companies do that, and they sort of get away with presenting this fantasy, experiment that like went 100% the way they wanted it to go, but behind it is a bunch of data that actually negates their direct observations. So I wonder, what role do you feel like negative data plays in that, or data that is not positive or does not promote your ideal? And then I also wanted to know the role, if you could talk a little bit more about the role of infantilization and in patenting, and how that affects global health. How like our global, like infantilization of the global south has then this negative effect on patents, and how sort of knowledge is archived within our larger systems, and how that then has a negative effect on global health, and how we sort of have this assumption that like if we maintain this power structure, then we will never suffer the consequences of that. But as we saw with the COVID pandemic, you cannot block off a whole section of the world and prevent disease from spreading. With globalization, if there's an outbreak in one country, it's gonna move to another country, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. No, great question. I think the data point, not my speciality, but from what I understand, I mean, I think, when there was a H5N1 crisis, there was a drug called Tamiflu, which was by Roche. It was the antiviral that many people were prescribed. The Cochrane Review, which is an independent body that looks at data, actually raised the alarm and said the drug was not that effective. But this was after Roche had made $18 billion. So to your point, we need far better regulation of data. I actually think, and this is something that's going on, a debate that's happening here in the US with the FDA, is that there's too much of a revolving door. The data that needs to be made transparent is not. It's all under confidential commercial trade secrets. And so there's every kind of, trade secrets are also an IP barrier. And so what they do is they say, well, these things shouldn't be allowed. I mean, just think that public court documents are supposed to be public. But when you're looking at a patent case, most of it's redacted because it's got commercial secrets. And so we don't really learn as the public of what's actually going on. And so to your first point, yeah, I think open data is very significant. It's like with artificial intelligence, which is where we're headed with all medical technology these days. It's like if we don't know the source code and how it's actually written, and how the AI is going to work, and what kind of inputs went into it, and then the outcomes that come with it, if there's biases, we're not going to get the solutions we want. And we've already seen that in some of the episodes of AI, and that's happening with a lot of drugs as well. So, and then the infantilization, could you just repeat that point, just so I remember it? I'm on New York time now.
It's infantilization of the global south by our economic powers,
Yeah.
and how that plays a role in like how knowledge is sequestered, and how that then affects patents, but also like global health in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is the it's almost, I think there are a couple of things to that. I think we've got the sort of like our way is the only way, and that's the only way knowledge systems work. But we're also having this problem now when you think about psychedelics, traditional healing systems, which is becoming a big part of the problem. And like anything capitalistic, if there's an opportunity for a market and make a big buck, they'll move into it. So they're trying to patent a lot of traditional medicine, which has been going on for years, but now certainly with psychedelics, because all of a sudden there's a lot of people in the West who want to take it. All of a sudden, it's kind of like, yeah, we're just going to implant the existing knowledge system on something that for thousands of years by communities has been part of their land, part of their heritage, that they have a different relationship with it, that you cannot patent this kind of stuff. But no, we just apply the same kind of system on it and then say, well, this is how it should be. And that these are communities that have been doing things differently for thousands of years. They have a relationship with nature, have a relationship that is very powerful to them. And it's not just to be used and abused. It's not to be mass produced. But unfortunately, the capitalistic model is that basically is consume, consume, consume.
Hi. So earlier you spoke about the racist factor and the need to decolonize IPs for medicine, and then the donation and philanthropy model. I was wondering how much you think white savior complex, that kind of concept, feeds into this donation and philanthropy model, and where the line is especially with COVAX, genuine intention versus kind of this parading of do good.
That's a good question. I think there is an element of superiority and savior complex. I think that's just naturally what happens when you're in a position of power. You think that your way is the right way, and I think these systems have been constructed in a way that that this is the best way to do it, or that basically the countries in the global south, they're not capable of making these things, or they just don't know how to do it, or that the pharmaceutical industry would say their main problem is getting even the drugs to the people, the last mile. It's not forget about making this stuff, just sort of we'll tell you how to, we'll give you what you need, but you just need to get it to the people. And I feel that is kind of infantilizing it a little bit, or a lot. And I do believe that when we talk about decolonization, now it's a buzzword and a term just like innovation that's kind of outgrown itself and no one knows what it really means. But really, it's like when we look at the global health structures, they're all very much Western-based. They're all influenced by white global northerners. I mean, when I was working in India, you would have people who were sitting in Harvard giving advice about policy, and they'd never actually even been on the ground in India. And this is endemic of the problem of policy in public health. And it's all paid for by certain power structures. So yeah, there is a lot of that in the system, and that's what I think the movement means by decolonizing, is getting people from the global south in those positions, making those decisions for their communities. Or at least having an equal balance of power. Now, of course, people might say, well, you've got the new Director General of the World Trade Organization, she's from Nigeria, but she's taught in the School of Economics of Capitalism. I don't think that's the kind of candidate you want.
Hi, thank you very much for this, to shed light on a very interesting and fascinating and it's very important issue. I guess my question is, since you are invited to give a talk by a public university in the United States, maybe I should ask a question about how do you see a public university in your open science paradigm? How does that actually, what is the role of the public universities to play into this? Now, of course, traditionally, public universities have been invested by government to do a lot of basic fundamental research. So that's one aspect of it. And we can go into talk about how government kind of de-invest into public education, into public university doing this type of research. We can go into a direction of, therefore a lot of universities actually seek out private funding to conduct some of the research. And now you came into the kind of the conflict, if you may, between that and where someone like Bill Gates, who, surprise, surprise, when he was totally against kind of open source, type of scientific research, because the whole Microsoft model is basically closed code and everything, and he's a strong opponent of not opening up any sort of open code software development, for example, and that's an extension of his thinking into his philanthropy education. But I guess also if you can comment on maybe more in kind of related to your domain is that, of course, public university also utilize the patent system. to actually get, to get the ball rolling in terms of, they patent some of the faculty invention to get more funding to get the ball rolling. Yeah. So I wonder whether, you can comment on how you think the public university, given this different aspect, how do they play a role into, open science research?
Yeah, if you think about since 1980, there was this act called the Bayh-Dole Act, which essentially kind of commercialized universities into technology centers that then would feed the corporations. And the idea was that basically, a lot of university science was just sitting on the shelf. And so this would inject this new impetus. And so basically, this act was there to help universities get rich, essentially, so that they could sell off their sort of research. I mean, in fact, I remember one drug, Lyrica, which came out of Northwestern University. I think they sold the rights to that drug to Pfizer, and it kind of paid for their endowment for about 3 years or something. But I think the problem is the incentives. I think if government was incentivizing with funding and saying, no, we're going to fund you more if you openly source and share that information, rather, even if it is patented, that you're going to open license it, then I think, yeah, basically we wouldn't have these technology centers at university that are all about how much profit can we make and how much can we actually get out of this. Instead of actually, let's change the incentives. Let's say, you know what, you're going to get much more in terms of grants if you actually open source it and make it go further than actually if you're just going to lock it down and just trying to get your big buck with a commercial deal with a pharmaceutical company. I mean, when you think about Durham University spins out so many small biotech firms. I mean, they're literally kind of taking government money, and individuals are becoming rich off it. That's how the guy at Pharmaset who created Sofaldi, Raymond Shinazi, during the day he was moonlighting at the Veterans Department. He was using Emory University facilities, and basically he was running his company, and actually licensed the compound from Emory University. And now, he made $500 million off that sale to Gilead for that drug. That is what's happening in the university structure. It's become literally a breeding ground for what I call like pharma billionaires now. We talk about the big tech guys and the people that started at Stanford with Google and what have you. That model is being applied to the pharmaceutical space. And that's what you have, with people like Moderna and all that stuff. They take government money, or they come out government funding. A lot of it was from the NIH. A lot of it started back in University of Pennsylvania, and then they claim it as their own. And now they're going around suing everyone, saying we created it.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was fascinating. I'm currently writing a book about the history of medicine used to treat snakebite, which was declared by the WHO as one of the world's top 5 neglected tropical diseases. And so I've been doing a lot of research and thinking about the landscape of disease and those that get classified as neglected tropical diseases. And I'm wondering if you see contours in the landscape of the amount of energy that gets poured into taking out patents as being more focused towards what are not considered to be neglected tropical diseases, i.e. diseases of the global south.
To be honest, I've not done that direct study of understanding the patents on tropical diseases. What I do know is when I think about organizations like Drugs for the Neglected Disease Initiative in Geneva, which has done some great work on actually focusing all its research on neglected diseases, because that's what they do. They are eventually always licensing in, trying to get access to these compounds. So companies are actually, through their research by serendipity, because a lot of science is serendipity, they find it might work on X or Y, and they basically just park it because there's no market for it. I mean, you think about when COVID started, remdesivir, which was the first product that we were all thought was going to be the one that was going to sort of treat COVID, started out as for Ebola, but then it kind of got parked and then they resurfaced it when there was a bigger market. So, yeah, I think a lot of these compounds or libraries of compounds that companies have, they just sit there unless there's a market. And obviously we know with neglected diseases, it's not really an appealing market, and so they don't invest in it. And then what you have is you have organizations like the Drug for Neglected Diseases. They try and get some of those so that they can then work with it. But it's still based on their goodwill.
Hey. Yeah, I want to say thank you for the talk. It's been really interesting. And my question, I know you talked about wanting to move to a future where we don't need financial incentives or to a certain degree and open science and stuff. But while we still, to a certain degree, need them, I was wondering, how do you think we can get there, considering that many drugs, they're often founded on research that comes from the government or R&D that comes from the government, but there's oftentimes a lot of money put in by companies themselves, and then there's also things like clinical trials, which are just naturally can run tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. So how can you make sure that the company, when they decide to do this clinical trial and put in this R&D, that they're going to know they're not going to lose money on this endowment, while also making sure that we get these drugs that are potentially life-saving to everyone who needs them? Further on that, do you think licensing can help with diversified manufacturing, as you were saying, where you basically use royalties to allow countries to develop their manufacturing base, but they do pay maybe $1 per drug to the company that put in the R&D?
No, and I think we're always going to have some financial incentives. Even within open science, there's going to have to be some aspect there's some arrangement, and I think that has to be unpacked a lot more. But I think, for example, if you just have a single actor that is controlling the marketplace, then obviously that is not a functioning marketplace. That's market failure. But that's the kind of system we live in, where you have one or two actors who just, like with the insulin, who basically control the marketplace, and that, by any economist speak, that's market failure. So I think what you have to do is you have to have systems where you can step in and say, you know what, we don't actually have other competitors in the marketplace, so we need to change that. So I think, even if it means that a company is going to not make, 50 billion, and they're going to make 25 billion, then we bring in other competitors to do that. And you're still going to get your return, but you can't just hold on to the market for longer and say, well, I'm just going to milk this for as long as possible. So I think there are ways of actually sort of managing the system, even in its current form, way better than it is, because we actually almost encouraging people to have monopolies for as long as possible. And I think that was never the intention. And I think in terms of sort of licensing, I think there'll always be some kind of sharing, but I think open sharing is better than licensing, because once it's licensing, you've still got this benevolence factor, like we've seen with the HIV drugs and the hepatitis C drugs. We'll give you X countries that you can sell in, but we're going to keep the bigger markets for ourselves. And I think it has to be more distributed equally in terms of capability. I just think that leaving power in one actor's hand is not going to achieve our ultimate goals. And I think, yeah, sure, people will say, well, I'm going to invest my money somewhere else. I'm saying, go ahead. Go try and create a different industry. They won't. They know they're going to still make billions of dollars. But the thing is, it's always this threat that companies say. You remember when we won this case in India against a cancer drug, and Novartis said, well, we're going to disinvest from India. They're still investing. They just use that as a threat because they have all the capital. And I think, if you're making billions of dollars, you're going to continue making billions of dollars. It's just that you're just not going to make hundreds of billions of dollars. And I think that's the difference.
So unfortunately, I'm afraid we have to close our evening. But before we leave, I just want to say that we're asking Tahir to give another talk, which will happen tomorrow at the Cultural Studies Symposium from 12:15 to 1:30, and that's in Humanities 1, room 210. Also, our website for our Sawyer Working Group has many other details about upcoming events, and I hope to see all of you at those events. And finally, Tahir, thank you, Tahir and Anna, for your participation tonight and for this sort of initial forum to help us reimagine more equitable futures. So thank you so much for coming to St.
Thank you.